should be nice. And if we're finished in 12 minutes, then we have to tap dance.
Okay. No, I don't think that'll happen, but
We have 5 minutes.
it was almost funny. I'm reading the front of the Times today, and the left section, the usual depressing stuff. It was about immigration and this guy Stephen Miller.
Oh, geez.
Oh, and I get so agitated.
This was his
with him.
opportunity to go after.
Okay. But then so I flip the page and I go into the financial section and I get to page 2 in there. And there's a write-up about a guy who just brought a car back from Italy from the 1970s. And he went through the whole thing because it was up above Milan and he just snuck it out before the huge problems up there.
Wow.
And so it made for an interesting read.
Yeah.
And I never saw the term published before, but it's going to be mentioned in here. The hobbyists call each other gearheads. I read this thing this morning in the article. Like, I've never seen it in writing. Hey, how did that happen today?
Gear heads.
Yeah. I never knew whether it was a term of endearment or whatever amongst the guys that were working on the cars. But here it was in the New York Times in print.
Can I ask you, as one of my questions, where the car is now?
Well, it was sold. I know where I sold it to. I don't know.
Each of us.
You need the microphone in a little bit.
All right, testing. Better?
Okay, testing again.
Oh, that sounds good. You sold it.
It was sold about 15 years ago.
When you say it was sold, did you sell it?
I sold it. I could say how I sold it. It was all part of the hobby. It was sold at a meet where you have the opportunity to sell stuff like that up in Rhinebeck.
Oh yeah, the antique cars.
It was on display, and
do you want to?
The guy came back a couple days later. He was from Teaneck, New Jersey. It went down to Jersey. Whatever happened after.
Do you want to disclose what you got for it, or
not really?
Okay, then good.
No, because this was not. You can ask me. It's not a moneymaker what I was working with.
Right.
The amount of time and money that I put into it, it's probably barely a break even. But I never looked at it as.
It was a hobby of love.
Yeah.
I'll get to see the pictures later. I think it's ready to go. Okay. It's another minute on this clock, but. Oh, all right. You tell us when. Usually we're on that screen, but where's it? Barely up there. Oh, barely up there. Oh, way up. Oh,
up in that.
I don't have that kind of vision.
No, I can't turn
I
to
see
see
the
it.
tablecloth. All right, so we should go now? Okay. Good afternoon, Woodland Ponders. Here we are Monday, and it's time for another Meet Your Neighbor. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Bill Barbash. Bill lives in the North Wing. He's been here since 2016. And you may know Bill from his participation in Artscope as a photographer and especially architectural photography. So, Bill, take it away.
Okay, well, here I am. Going to just start with giving a very brief description of my early years. I grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. My parents were both trained. My father was a dentist at age 22. My mother became a school teacher at age 20. And so from the early days, I became a latchkey kid. Early on, I developed a lot of eye-hand skills, probably through the hand skills of my father with his practice. Developed an interest in cars. I did some stamp collecting, and photography started also very early. Among the things that stand out were a 5th and 6th grade teacher I had at PS 186, Mrs. Sokoloff. And what she did was put the whole class on the subway and take us to museums. And we must have done that, I don't know, a dozen or more times during those 2 years. That was a wonderful experience. Summers during that period spent in Peekskill. My father was instrumental and had his hands in the building of a small house near a bungalow colony with a day camp. And I was there from about the age of 4 to 15. And while that was going on, my father was fixing teeth during the week in Brooklyn, and he was a weekend do-it-yourselfer when he would be up in Peekskill. My high school years, I went through a competitive exam for Brooklyn Technical High School, an all-male school at that time, and I attended there for 4 years. While in high school, I played the clarinet in the school band, and somehow I got into a music program at the University of Rhode Island. I believe it was after my time I was about 15. And it was sort of like a conservatory training compressed into a month for a bunch of teenagers. Music theory, composition, orchestra, chorus. I can't say that I remember the details and all of that from those years, but it was a lot of fun. And it was also an introduction for me. There were a lot of girls there. That, I believe, had a strong influence in my lifetime passion for classical music. After that, I attended RPI up in Troy, again, an all-male school at the time, received a bachelor in mechanical engineering, followed with a fellowship for an additional year, and got a master's in mechanical engineering back in 1956 at the ripe old age of 21. Became a licensed professional engineer and also got a master's in electrical engineering from Brooklyn Poly. My employment after college was at Ford Instrument, unrelated to the car manufacturer. It was a division of Sperry Rand in Queens, and I worked there for 7 years. Following that, I worked at Bell Labs in Manhattan in the West Village for 3 years. Now, backtracking just a second to that Ford Instrument job, I was a young engineer there, and there were a lot of other young engineers there too. Some were single, as I was, and it was on a weekend singles trip skiing out of a bus from Manhattan that I met my future wife, Sue. Among these engineers that were there, we sort of broke up into two groups amongst the youngsters. The single guys, and then there were a bunch of young married fellows that were starting to raise families, and they had bought houses on Long Island and post-war surge of housing. And on Monday morning, the groups sort of broke apart. These single guys were talking about, what did you do over the weekend? And the other guys were talking about, as typical engineers, what were the do-it-yourself jobs for the weekend? So beyond that, after Bell Labs closed in Manhattan, they were moving out to Columbus, Ohio, I decided to change jobs. I came up to IBM in late 1966, and I worked there until early retirement in 1992. Was always involved in computer development while at IBM. Now stepping forward, something of great interest to me was a hobby that I got involved in. It was car restoration. And sitting on the table, when you're facing the pictures there to your left, you'll see the car as a before situation, and the restored car is to the right. And it is a Model A 1928 touring car, which is also known as a Phaeton. And took a long time to do. It was an 8-year project. Sometimes you could say, was it just persistence or was it really an obsession? Now, at one point while I was working on the car, my mother was visiting, and Sue says to my mother, gee, he spends an awful lot of time down in the garage. And my mother's wise answer, which was appropriate, was, well, at least you know where he is. so
Staying out of trouble.
So as this hobby progressed and after the restoration, I had the opportunity to display the car at the Mills Mansion where there was an annual show every October. And in 1990, we were there in costume, and I'm going to just try and show this picture. This picture was in the Monday edition of the Poughkeepsie Journal. We were in vintage clothing, car behind me, and you can see the Mills Mansion up on the hill. So that was a nice day that we had. Now, because of the lockdown, I couldn't do something that I would have normally been doing yesterday. Yesterday was scheduled to be the annual Rhinebeck Antique Car Show. It's been running there. This was supposed to be the 50th anniversary show. And each of the local clubs participates in that event. And I would have been there yesterday as part of a judging team. The other thing is that coincidentally today, I'm looking in the New York Times and getting agitated by the news on the front page. And I put that down. I get into the financial page, and on page 2 is this interesting story about someone who brought back a car from Italy. And it was done just recently, and he somehow or other got this thing done just before the huge flare-up of COVID in Italy. But what got to me was I had never seen this term in print. Us car guys, the restorers and so on, use a term on each other, and sometimes I'm not sure that it's endearing or not, but they call each other gearheads. I saw that in print today, describing the guy who brought the car in. Beyond that, beyond the hobby of car restoration, another big thing that I look back on was we had a motorhome back in 1977 that we bought for primarily the initial intention was to take this on a cross-country loop and visit many of the national parks. And we did that, and some of the parks that we got to were Mesa Verde, Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon. We also got into Sequoia National Park, started looping to the north, and we swung around and came back through up into the northern states, and we came back and saw Yosemite, Glacier Park, and Yellowstone.
And by that time, you had the 2 children?
Yes, that was all part of this story. We had a 9 and an 11-year-old at the time.
That's a lot of traveling with 2 children.
I was going to make a little point on that too. My 9-year-old son was my navigator. This was all before we had GPS, and he sat in the passenger captain's seat to my right with a lot of maps, and he was pretty good at that. And no cell phone, as I said, no GPS, and all I had was a CB radio. 11-year-old Rachel, we kept her, she had the task of keeping a logbook. Okay, and along the way we came up with a definition. I'm sure others could relate to this. We called it a family discussion. And that's what happened at about 5 p.m. after driving for many hours. The 2 kids are at that point bickering with each other. Sue is also ready for a stop. And at about that time, I think all 4 voices are pretty much elevated. And that's what we defined as a family discussion. We had the thing beyond the trip. I had it for about 5 more years and took many other trips. We were up at Acadia Park in Maine. We were out on New Brunswick to the Bay of Fundy. We went to Prince Edward Island. We went south to the Outer Banks. I used it for a couple of trips down to Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was an annual mecca for the Antique Car Club in October. And I used that. There are some fields down there where you can park and actually stay in your motorhome.
Were you into photography this cross-country trip?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Unfortunately, The pictures are primarily slides.
Oh,
They're sitting in the apartment, packed up in a box,
I have the same thing.
and
It's very
how,
hard.
how to make something out of them, I don't know. It will
No.
take a lot of patience and work.
Yeah. It's very difficult and very expensive to convert from slides to prints.
Well,
Very few places do that, at least around here.
maybe I will get to it at some point. I don't know.
Well, if you get to yours, maybe you can get to mine too.
Hey,
They're
good
all in a
idea.
box.
Yes, yes. Well, shortly after, we had the motorhome for about 5 years, and we a little bit restless. Kids went off to college eventually, and considered ourselves empty nesters. So in the 1980s, we bought a condo in the Berkshires, and that's a nice adult playground with Tanglewood nearby and so
Sure.
many other things to do. We had that for about 10 years. And now I'm creeping up towards my early retirement from IBM in 1992. We did some traveling. After Sue retired, she followed me into retirement a couple of years later. A lot of foreign travel to the British Isles, to Europe, many of the countries, Israel, Japan, Taiwan, and we still did quite a bit of domestic travel. One of the interesting trips was out to West Texas, and from there we went into the Copper Canyon in Mexico.
Mm.
We also did a nice loop type trip on a ship through the inland passage up through Alaska. We've been to San Antonio, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, New Mexico, California, and much more.
Wonderful.
Now, moving forward, or during the same time period, actually in 1993, I joined a recently created lifetime learning program, which was affiliated with Marist College. It's called the Marist College Center for Lifetime Studies, otherwise CLS. I'm still a member, but of course we're on shutdown there too, and it's hard to tell whether or not that will even pick up again in September.
I think they put certain courses online. I had gotten an email about that.
There's some of it is online, but it doesn't replicate, as we're finding out, just
We're
like
all- yeah.
what we're doing here right now. It doesn't
No,
replicate.
and the schools are learning that remote learning leaves a lot to be desired.
I was hearing that from my son last night
Does
with his kids. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, he's a home instructor now.
Yes, and well, he himself is a professor, so he's doing his own work from at home and doing some teaching and exams and so on
Mm,
with students who have dispersed actually around the world now.
yes,
And he's got his kids there to try and keep them occupied also.
it's very hard.
So anyhow, with this CLS program, I being a technical person, somehow or other decided to make a little switch. They offered courses in the physical sciences as well as the arts and so on. He says, enough of the physical science. I shifted to the arts, and I was in classes related to music, literature, art appreciation, and architecture. Now, the classes are taught by volunteers, but each class uses a CLS member as the manager of the class. He sort of is the coordinator of getting the class set up and the go-between with the presenter and stuff like that. I volunteered as the music class manager, and I held that job for about 20 years.
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
And the instructor in that class is a skilled musicologist, Leslie Gerber. Some of you, if you go over to the Met Live, or had been going to the Met Live performances related at the Bardavon, he would very often be the presenter just ahead of the opera. He'd be on the stage giving a little description. He did work, and his subjects range from classic to jazz, and he's also become a friend, and he certainly was somebody that made me much more knowledgeable on with the music. Now, along the way, I did mention architecture. there was an architecture class that caught my attention, and it was taught by a practicing architect uh, named Jay Johnson. He is a person of color with a Columbia University architecture degree, with also a very strong history of family and academia. He was also a lecturer of architecture at Vassar College, but his CLS classes, which he taught, started with the basics of Greek architecture and Greek orders and elements. But then he got into Hudson Valley architecture from colonial to current. And I found the material fascinating. And he also introduced some of the arts and crafts architecture and a little bit of Frank Lloyd Wright. Just a little side note about Jay Johnson. His name sounds like Jay, but the spelling is unusual. It's Jeh.
Oh,
I never met his son, who is also carries the name Jeh, but he's someone you may have actually seen on TV and the news. He was the Obama administration Pentagon counsel, and then he was the Secretary of Homeland Security. Even recently, I've seen him interviewed on the TV news. Uh, anyhow, as I've learned about the Frank Lloyd Wright and some of the craftsmen architects, I started looking much more deeply into Frank Lloyd Wright and his contemporaries. And I became somewhat interested in modernist and contemporary architects. So I've spanned the period probably from the late 1800s right up to current. And along the way, I also went and saw many of Frank Lloyd Wright's works. Certainly, probably the one that most of you have probably been to would be Guggenheim Museum. And one of the most iconic of his works, and maybe considered the best, is Falling Water out in Pennsylvania.
I think you and Ginny Cannon share that deep
Yes,
interest
yes.
in Frank Lloyd
I
Wright.
even mentioned her in
Oh,
a second
okay.
here. Yes. So I've seen much of his work. And even recently, I had the opportunity to be out in California this past November. My son was on a sabbatical at the University of California in Irvine and spent about a week and a half, 2 weeks there. And I got myself up to Los Angeles to see a house that he did back in the 1920s, the Hollyhock House. So I'm still looking, not as much as early on because it takes quite a bit of traveling. But along the way, about 15 years ago, I had already collected quite a bit of material. And I was saying to myself, gee, maybe I have enough to put together a lecture for the CLS group. And they had a course which was art and art history. And it was broken up with different presenters each week. And I volunteered, and they were going to, I had a 75-minute slot. That was the length of the classes. And I was getting a little bit wound up as I was pulling the material together and saying to myself, gee, am I going to be able to fill up this time slot?
Oh.
Well, as it would happen, I get up there and I start talking, and time ran out. So I never really could quite finish what I had thought. So that gave me the idea that, hey, maybe we can put together a little bit more. So I subsequently did some 3 and 4 session classes, and it started with primarily with Wright. Then I shifted to Wright and his contemporaries. What else was going on at the time he was doing his architecture? And there was a certain category of arts and crafts within this country, but there was also a lot going on in Europe. And so I got involved studying some of those architects and pulled that type of material together also. And while doing that, I would say that there are also many things that I've seen pretty close to our backyard in the Hudson Valley.
Yes, yeah. Do you participate in the annual Historic House Tour sponsored by the Walker Valley Land Trust.
No, I haven't done
No.
that, but I have been in for those annual lectures where they come in.
The vernacular architecture.
Vernacular, yes, and I got to understand what that meant
Yeah. It was a
early
stretch for
on.
me, yeah.
And
We had to cancel the house tour this year. It would have been the 10th,
oh,
but because of the virus,
mhm,
there will be one next year, hopefully, and it'll be of the northern New Paltz area.
mhm.
So maybe we can rope you in to
Okay,
be a
yes.
docent for that.
Because I do have to admit, having spent 50 years on the other side of the river, this is sort of more foreign territory.
Oh,
Not
yeah.
that we hadn't been to New Paltz many, many times, but
Right. It's different.
but on the other side of the river, I think that certainly a gem of architecture, and it's kind of eclectic, is walking the Vassar College campus.
Oh, yes,
And
yes.
that's something that we lived close by, and that was always something that I enjoyed doing.
What I
And-
like about the campus, as much as the architecture, the arboretum. I mean, the trees are so spectacular and so old, many of them.
Mhm. But it offers and what I find interesting, and you see this on many college campuses, the fact that they don't try and match the architecture from the original. You may have a central part of a campus with some very classical looking buildings, and then the stuff over the years as they grow and build new stuff, they head into something that's more contemporary. And I find that the mix is generally good. I've heard some people criticize it and say, oh, this is a hodgepodge of stuff, but I think it's progression, and it looks appropriate to me because they do have, aside from the main building, which was a Renwick building that dates back to the 1860 or so, and he was the same Renwick that designed the hospital out on Roosevelt Island.
Did he do St. Patrick's Cathedral?
I'm not sure of
No,
that.
we had a Renwick someplace in the city.
But the Renwick you would find right on the island there. That was, I think, a hospital many, many years. And when you look at pictures of it, it has some resemblance in style to the main building on the Vassar campus, the building that faces the entry gate.
Yeah, that would have been the Kohler Hospital, perhaps.
I think so.
Yeah.
Tuberculosis or
It
whatever
was,
else it was used
It was
for.
on the news recently. It played some part in this virus. I don't know exactly what.
Possibly. There's a lot of construction on that island. This is just an aside, and we'll have to just step along. But on that island, the very southern tip, a memorial park was designed down there by the architect Louis Kahn. And it was done, he died about 40 years ago. The city ran out of money at the time. It was never constructed. It's a Four Freedoms Park, the very southern tip of the island. And I got to visit it about 5-6 years ago when it had just been recently dedicated.
That's Roosevelt with the statue. Is it a statue of Roosevelt?
Not so much, there may be a small statue of Roosevelt, but there's symbology there for yeah, there is a Roosevelt statue, but the Four Freedoms, which was his creed during World War II.
Right.
And this was now, finally, 40 years after the design, it did get itself implemented, and it's a beautiful spot down.
It is. Yeah, I've seen it on the news.
But while on the island, there was construction going on as we walked from the tramway to the south, and Cornell University was building some additional facilities there, some biotechnology facilities. So possibly what you're talking about with the COVID research, maybe.
Now, Bill, I'm looking at the clock and we have 5 minutes. You
Mhm.
haven't even spoken about this magnificent
Okay.
photograph.
Okay.
So I'll let
Well,
you use the 5 minutes.
We
however you
can
want.
wrap this up. We're gonna go very quickly now. I've covered the architecture. I just said earlier that I wanted to give a thank you to Halema for organizing this, but also, and Halema also is a good spotter for me for material in architectural stuff. And so is Ginny Cannon, who has a strong background in Frank Lloyd Wright, especially from her Buffalo roots, because there was a lot of work done by him. Okay, now just to kind of wrap this thing up, what I have in the background here is this gem of the Hudson Valley up at Bard College. That's the Fisher Center designed by Frank Gehry. It was dedicated back in 2003. I personally think it's an acoustical marvel, and I think it's a great place to be in. And if it wasn't for COVID, I would probably be up there again, enveloped in sound, listening to some
Sure.
good music, and I just can't wait.
There was a story you told in one of the ArtScope openings that I may be wrong about the country, but there's this building that goes like this. Is it Germany? Or?
No, I think I have the picture is on my
Yeah,
wall.
it's a curvy building,
Mm.
and your bus driver was not going to stop there. And you, oh no, how could I miss this? And somehow you got him to stop.
Yes, that was in Prague,
Prague.
and it's known as the Fred and Ginger Building, just because of the shape of the thing. It looks like
It looks like they're
Ginger
down.
with this
Yes.
flaring
Yes.
skirt coming out, and that was a Frank Gehry design.
Yeah,
And
and you did show that in the
Mhm.
show.
And-
Did you want to mention anything about your family in the last few minutes, or whatever you would like?
well, I just had a little closing comment about
Oh.
Woodland Pond, and
Yeah,
I think we're going to run this out at
Good.
this point.
We need
Uh,
another 30
Oh,
minutes.
okay. I've been at Woodland Pond since 2016. The experience here has been bittersweet. Sue and I came here after she was found to have some mild cognitive issues. The progression was swift, and my wife of 55 years passed away last year. And coincidentally, today, May 4th, happens to be her birthday. Uh, I can say it was the right move for us at the time, and that it's the right place for me now. And I'm involved in a few activities here. ArtScope was mentioned. I'm in the memoir writing group. I use the fitness room and the wood shop. And I'm currently employed at Woodland Pond. I'm one of the volunteer meal delivery
Yay.
deputies.
That's a critical job
But
here.
I'm waiting to get the sheriff's star badge. Just as a closing comment, as I prepared today's conversation, it dawned on me that there's a thread to all of my lifetime, and it was unplanned. I'm a product of the Hudson Valley, being born down below the Narrows along New York Harbor, in Brooklyn, went to college in Troy, spent summers in Peekskill, also in Woodstock, Ulster Park, and then 50 years in Poughkeepsie. So somehow or other, I'm in the Hudson Valley, and it's a good place to have been.
Oh, well, Bill, thank you so much. I think our residents got a glimpse of Bill, the person behind the meal delivery and behind ArtScope, and really thank you so very
Okay.
much.
Okay, thank you, Halema.
You, sir, are natural. Yes.
Hey, we made it.
You are a natural.
I never have been.
Oh, you were